Welcome to Better on the Inside, a podcast about soul care in the digital age. This is your host and pastor, John Pyle.
What's up, y'all? I'm so pumped to be back. This week we have a real humdinger of an episode talking about something that you might not think about, but affects you every single day. Place. Our guest today is Seth Kaplan, who wrote the book Fragile Neighborhoods. He's an expert on fragile states, but he took his knowledge and expertise that is usually applied to volatile nations and examined the social decay in modern America. Place is a concept we think a lot about on some level and never on another. Like, we consider where we are and where we want to go pretty often, probably on a daily basis, getting to your daily commute, getting the kids to school, getting to work, etc. But we rarely consider how our environments, our homes, our workplaces, schools, parks, common spaces, and our churches even shape our relationships. Whether we know it or not, we are profoundly impacted by the design of where we live, work, eat, shop, and worship. And that design has changed dramatically over the last few decades, whether it's good for us or not. Listen to Seth talk about this. So what got you into looking at neighborhoods and relationships in America?
First, think that for the last 15 years or so, I have focused on fragile states. And that means Nigeria, that means Sri Lanka, Somalia, and so on and so forth. And so a lot of people in Washington know me for my work on fragile states.
Mm-hmm.
And the transition from overseas to domestic was 2015, 2016. We had an election season that made a lot of people very anxious. And they began to think, is America a fragile state? And they started asking me. It wasn't like one person, it was 5, 6, 7 people. I'm having coffee. I'm going to visit somebody. What is going on to America? Are we also a fragile state? And someone who had just come back from like Nigeria, where I have always gone often throughout my life, and you have to worry about going on highways in the nighttime and not
Right.
being kidnapped. America is not in the situation of a Nigeria where they have low-level violence in many, many parts of the country, and it's completely different than here, and you just don't feel safe almost anywhere. And but it made me think. It made me question what is going on in America. And for me, when I look at a country overseas in the United States, the single most important question is always what is the nature of relationships? What I have learned over and over again, looking at lots of countries, I've worked in about 35 countries. I probably traveled to about 75, is that the single most important dynamic that you want to pay attention to in a country is social dynamics, relationships between people, maybe also social institutions that support or constrain that. And so when people ask me that question, I immediately says, we have to figure out what is wrong with American relationships. And I traveled the country, spoke to a lot of people, visited places like Shreveport, places like Eastern Kentucky, Detroit, Baltimore, so on and so forth. And basically talking to a lot of people, I think the big question that I came up with is, given that we didn't have social decay 2 generations ago, anywhere like what we have now, we had problems 2 generations ago, but we didn't have social decay like we have now. Now we have enormous social decay, which leads to mistrust, polarization, deaths of the spirit, lots of social problems. What has changed in those 2 generations? And what I discovered in this research, in this journey to meet lots of people, read lots of books, is the biggest change is in the nature of our relationships day in and day out with other people close to us. Mm-hmm. So whereas we used to be embedded in lots of thick relationships and institutions in our neighborhood, we are now pretty much alone, lonely, isolated. We may have some networks, we may have some relatives, but we're not embedded in these thick relationships like a security blanket of people that are there to support you and you support them in various ways. And that, I feel, that is the problem that's beneath all the other social problems that we are having. And we need to start there to think about what to do about our country.
Yeah, I love that. It's almost like you're pulling a thread on a sweater and you figure out where it came loose, right? Because you're looking at all of these issues and going, what's the commonality? And so,
Exactly, exactly. We can't
yeah,
look at them separately. We got to think they're all coming from some common source.
yeah, and diverse issues, even as like digital conversations around how much media should our kids consume, and then we've got political polarization, and we've got family, we've got poverty, we've got these very diverse kind of issues, even economic and real estate issues, right? We've got all these issues that we're going, well, let's try to solve this one this way, and let's try to solve this one this way. And what I loved about what you're doing is you're bringing the commonality to those of going, if we can address this part, right? The thinning of these thick relationships that have thinned out, that is how we can address a lot of this. And I think that does something to the anxiety of people in America, in the sense of, I think it actually provides something that we can do that's not just going, well, I hope we elect the right person. And so, how has your research, as you've talked to people, how has it impacted those individuals as you're kind of sharing some of this with them?
Well, first, I think you said it very well, John. We should not look for politics as a solution. Yes, I'd like different people elected. I like different policies. I advocate for different causes, but we need to understand that the places where we can have the biggest impact is basically are on real people, real problems, real places near us. And the more we
Mm,
direct our energy close to home, the more we will be able to actually make people's lives better. And that's something I think is really important. And so when I speak to a lot of people, basically I spend time trying to find social entrepreneurs that were trying to improve relationships at scale. And there's not really a field. There's a lot of social entrepreneurs doing good work, but there's not really anyone thinking about the small number of people that are only focused on relationships. And
mm,
so I think when I reach out, for example, to those people and I say, you're doing something really different from everybody else, and then you need to be elevated and praised for your work, of course, they find it very gratifying. I think I call them social repairers. They're basically people actually repairing our society. They're not just delivering. I mean, homelessness is a problem, hunger is a problem. I mean, we could talk about all the material problems in our
yeah.
society, and I'm pained by those problems. But I think we need to understand the stronger, the more resilient our society is, the less likely those problems would ever occur in the first place, and the better we would be able to address problems like that would occur. Like I'm just thinking in my neighborhood, I'll give you a very specific example. My daughter, who's 11 years old, her best friend in class in school had basically had cancer. Was discovered
Mm,
with cancer this year, and has spent the year undergoing chemo. And that could have been a devastating experience. She lost her hair, could have been ostracized, could have been treated badly. But because we live in an abundance of loving relationships, we have a community school, we have a lot of neighbors. I know this family personally, a lot of other people do. The neighborhood rallied around this child, and people supported the family, supported the child. I mean, I can see her out doing bake sales literally without, she got a wig, but she threw off the wig. She didn't feel that she needed the wig. I mean, you see her, and
mhm.
it's a sense of, I feel like I'm joyful when I walk around my neighborhood, because people just are, they're caring for each other. Not necessarily we're friends, but we have these relationships of care, and it just changes the whole dynamic around us. She being one of 100 examples I could give. So I mean, for me, there's a certain thing when you dedicate yourself or your organization to focusing on relationships. The thing is, there's very few of these, and they're hard to find. I think churches in particular should be playing this role, or any house of worship, but it's not often the primary goal of organizations today in America.
I really enjoyed talking to my dude, Seth. We joked around that we practically recorded an entire podcast before I actually hit the record button on this one. I definitely want to talk to him again. Maybe this time it'll just be a fun chat, not even about a book. In his book, though, Seth spends a lot of time talking about the difference between place-based community and network-based community. He'll define it really well in this segment, but it's important to note that network-based community is very new and has been enabled by technology. Up until very recently, all humans have been dramatically limited by our place. Our ancestors lived almost their entire lives in a bubble of a few miles. Think about that. Even our grandparents were constrained by where they happened to be born. But that's not the world our kids live in now. And that matters. How? Listen to Seth. If you're somebody here who, maybe is detached from their place or not feeling like they're at a good place or whatever that is, does it have to be place-based? And why does it have to be place-based? And what role does the network play in that?
So first, let me just explain what I mean by place-based to network-based.
Yes,
So it used to be, I think if for all of human history, we have humanity has for the great majority of people have all lived in place-based community of some sort. That means you didn't have a car. You mostly went, you travel by foot or by horse or whatever it was. You had a limit on your geography, and that the place you lived had houses of worship, had churches, had maybe a school, had some government, had some association, and it had a lot of relationships. It might have had a market, it might have had some stores, some businesses, whatever. People did things for each other. The point is, we had these thick relationships that we were embedded in, and they supported us. That's basically the norm throughout human history. And I still think it's the norm in most of the world. Then we went after World War II, partly how we built the environment, partly the fact that a lot of things were nationalized, careers became nationalized, education, people went far away to university, people and things like that. People aspired to move to a few big cities. The business went from local retail to Walmart and these big box retailers. So basically, think everything went to big box religion, big box shopping, internet this, and so you have all these changes in our life, and you thrive in that environment because you're in a series of networks, professional networks, networks from school, maybe some family networks. The point is, there's a series of networks that you join. And if you want to join an association, you seek out an association that is a network, an affinity, or a professional association you join. And those are networks that are all designed to help you advance, because everything is geared to the individual getting ahead. And so that works wonderful for some people, even many people. Our economy is incredibly dynamic. But what it means is, what about the places that have no good networks? They're disconnected. What about the people who don't have the right networks? Or what about the people, someone like me who often likes to sit in his cave and not is out there socializing? If you put me in the room with everybody at a cocktail hour, I'm in the room, I'm in the corner reading a book. I'm not really good at networking, talking. So if you have those individuals or those places, or they have the bad networks, there's a lot of people in those situations, and they basically are being marginalized, left behind. When you see that so many people are mistrustful or alienated, it's because 2 generations ago, they were engaged in an institution that they could actually contribute to, help uplift, and help contribute to a place. Today, they're alone, they're disconnected. They feel that everything is being done to them, not that they can do anything contributing. So it basically creates a very negative dynamic between people and society. And so again, that's the journey that we've taken. I think it's really important to understand the journey.
Yes.
And then so some people will do fine, but I think the big question is, how do we create a society? So it's your second question, and I don't want to go so long, is about the role of place. So for some people, they don't need place. They have good friends, they have good networks, and that's great. But I think for most of us, it is this the idea that if we want to have a level of intimacy and we want to have a network of mutual support and just people that we can be with or talk to or do things with in a more regular, and again, relationships need to be regular, they need to recur, and sometimes they need to be spontaneous, whatever it is. Most of us have many fewer relationships like these than we used to. That's very hard to achieve except by place. You could do some of this virtually,
Mm.
but those relationships are much thinner than if you belong to a place-based institution that was trying to do something for the place in some ways, or just had a purpose like a house of worship, a church, or whatever it is. That's a much thicker relationship. So it
Yeah.
has a very different dynamic. And the more of those that there are, the less there will be people left behind. I'm sorry for the long answer there. You gave
Oh,
me a long question.
yeah. Don't you dare apologize. That was so good. I love the concept of thick and thin relationships. That's really good terminology for us to adopt that I think could bring more clarity to how we define community. I know that it's much easier to have a lot of thin relationships than even just a few thick ones. At least that's how it is in my life. Maybe that's similar to yours. That's something to think about this week. Where are your relationships thin? Where are they thick? What do you have a lot of? What do you have a little of? What do you need more of? Part 2 drops next week, where Seth and I dive deeper into the role of churches and places of worship and how they can play those roles in healthy community. In the meantime, pick up his book, Fragile Neighborhoods by Seth Kaplan. That is Kaplan, Kaplan, wherever books are sold. Love y'all, and I'll see you next week. Okay, not quite done. I wanted to take a moment and just take a moment to directly tie, what does this mean for our souls, right? I talked about thin and thick relationships, and part of the social decay that we're experiencing is the thinning of all of our relationships, the thinning. And so if you think about like a favorite shirt or sweater where the fabric thins, or spots in your carpet where the fabric thins, or hair, as somebody who's bald, your hair thins versus thickens. And part of the way that our neighborhoods are built and what we're seeing in our society is the thinning of all of our relationships, not just friendships, but the thinning of family relationships, the thinning of school relationships, the thinning of relationships with our kids. Our relationships are thinning. And when our relationships thin, our souls suffer. And uh, thin relationships are not bad. It's not that thin relationships are bad. It's not that boundaries are bad. It's not that we need X, Y, or Z. That's not what I'm trying to say. But I'm saying, if you don't have thick relationships, if there isn't a community that knows you deeply at a soul level, it's going to hurt your soul. It just is. And in this digital age where we've moved to a more network based community where we know people from around the world that share a lot of common interests, it's harder and takes more of an intentional effort for those relationships to be thick. It's not impossible, but it just takes more time. And so what I'm seeing most people have are a few thin relationships, or many thin relationships, but nobody that knows them deeply on a soul level. And when that happens, that kind of atrophies. If you don't connect with people on a soul level, that relationship can't feed you on a soul level. As shallow as the relationship is as shallow or as deep as it's going to invest in your soul, and vice versa. And so when it comes to the thinning of relationships and the proliferation of thinner, more acquaintance type of relationships based on network and affinity and our interests and all that, it does something to our soul. There's something to having people that know us, right? It's the Cheers effect where everybody knows your name, but it goes beyond knowing your name. It's knowing your job and knowing who you are, knowing your personality, and connecting with you on a deeper level. And you have to have thick relationships to have a healthy soul. You just do. That deepest part inside of you. People have to know you. You have to be known, and you have to know others. Not like be recognized. I mean, be known. And so what Seth is talking about connects to a pretty big problem of not being known. And he gets into it a little bit, but it creates a lot of trouble in our society. And so it's concerning to me, this lack of community and social decay, as he calls it, because the social decay corresponds to a decay in our souls. So before I left, I really just wanted to take a moment to talk about that, although it's a little longer than a moment now. But that was really important to me to connect the dots for this episode. All right. I love you guys again.
Thank you for listening to Better on the Inside. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast wherever you're listening. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Send your questions and comments to John, Jon, at betterontheinside.com.